Utilitarianism always and inevitably leads to, involves, and justifies authoritarianism. As the simple thesis of this video, it's a video that is in part inspired by the sincere stupidity of another YouTuber named CosmicSkeptic. He's stupid, but I'm sure he's sincere and has good intentions. He doesn't really understand how dangerous the ideas he's playing with are, politically, ethically, or I may say philosophically. So I make this short discussion as a sort of warning, at least to the members of my own audience, who may have noticed that here on the internet, utilitarianism in the 21st century, it is going through a little bit of a revival of interest. And it's a certain kind of person who's getting interested in the dusty old books of John Stuart Mill now in the 21st century. It's the sort of person who wants to believe that there's an objectively real standard of what is in your best interest as an individual, and that there's an objectively real standard for what is in the best interest of our society as a whole, the greater good. That the pleasure-pain calculus yields a knowable, objectively real measure of what is best for you and for us, and that that's not merely the opinion of the people who happen to be in power. Again, it may be political power, the leader of a country, or the coterie of a few dozen people, the elite of a government, democratic or not. Most countries, there are just a few dozen people at the top. Even if they call themselves a democracy, it probably operates like an oligarchy in between elections. It's a big problem we have in the 21st century. Or if you're talking about, say, the directors of a hospital, or the directors of a university, or the directors of a foundation, there's a similar question of a small elite of people in positions of authority who decide what is in the best interest of others, what is in the best interest of the students, of the patients, whatever. And you know, there's an unexamined reliance of the philosophy of John Stuart Mill on a German philosopher who's completely forgotten in the English language called Wilhelm von Humboldt. Humboldt is still famous in Germany, but outside of Germany, he's completely forgotten. And this is slippery. The type of reasoning we engage in with this, as I say, implicitly authoritarian line of reasoning about making judgments about what's in the greater interest of everyone and then applying them to individuals, or vice versa. You can apply it to individuals and work your way up to apply to society as a whole. With Humboldt, he's primarily a philosopher of education. And you can choose examples in the philosophy of education or in the field of education that are very flattering to the utilitarian view of the world, right? Washing your hands to remove bacteria to prevent the spread of disease. This is something so useful that so much improves society, that so much improves your life as an individual and the welfare of society as a whole, that it's very easy to come to the conclusion that on a utilitarian basis, we ought to force everyone to believe in and practice this principle of hygiene. We ought to educate the whole population about the bacterial theory of disease. Sorry, technically it's called the germ theory of disease, but bacteria and viruses. We ought to educate the whole public. We ought to have teachers and school children and even priests and vicars and nuns. We ought to mobilize all of society to know about this science and live their lives accordingly. And of course, at the time John Stuart Mill was alive, not everyone knew about this. Wilhelm Humboldt and so on too. And of course still today, depending on where you live in the world. Back when I lived in places like Laos and Cambodia, you met people who really did not know where sickness came from. You met people who really lived with a lot of misconceptions about these things. And another example really quickly, I met a lot of people in Laos who really did not know that burning plastic in a fire released toxic fumes that were bad for them. They were totally unaware that they'd take plastic and they would treat it like wood in a fire. Even though the smell is really bad, they didn't have this concept that you could have a noxious gas produced by a fire. So when you're talking about this kind of simple example taken from the health sciences, now we seem to have, an objectively real, scientifically certain standard of something that is in your best interest and my best interest and our best interest, and that society can be ruled by these simple utilitarian conclusions. And it almost doesn't matter who's in charge. It doesn't matter if it's a communist government or a kingdom with a hereditary monarch or a democracy, no matter who is in charge, you should know about washing your hands, how to avoid getting sick in terms of bacteria. Okay? There's a limited range of these examples. And as soon as we step outside of that, the authoritarian implications of this utilitarian view of the world become evident very quickly. Society needs nurses. Society benefits from having more nurses. In many societies around the world, not all, but in many, there's a shortage of nurses. Should you force people to become nurses? I've known 2 women myself, in my life, only 2 I'm remembering at any rate, who received free education to become a nurse. They weren't forced. No, one of them was forced. One of them was forced and one had a choice, actually, out of these 2 women. But they received free education to become qualified as nurses, and they both decided they hated this job so much, they hated the type of work so much, they were not going to do it. They were going to try to strike off in a different direction, some other kind of business, some other kind of life. Okay? Being a nurse, it's very easy to say in this kind of utilitarian, objectively real calculus, what do you mean? It's a well-paying job. It's good for you. It helps other people. It's good for society as a whole. In terms of this utilitarian calculus, especially if you're talking about a woman who has already gone through the hard work of completing nursing college, you ought to be a nurse. You should be a nurse. Benefits you, benefits society. It's for the greater good, the greatest number of people. Being a nurse involves wiping the poo out of someone's bum who has diarrhea, right? It involves spending time with elderly people who are quivering and quaking in their hospital bed and helping to bathe them, wipe the poo off them, and help them. It's helping them. You are making the world a better place. You're helping that one person, no doubt. Not for everybody. Subjectively, some people can do that job and feel good about themselves and feel it's rewarding, and maybe partly because they're aware it's for the greatest good of the greatest number of people, okay? And some people would find it miserable and denigrating and beneath their dignity and beneath contempt. And these sorts of questions seem to be asked the least when we have an overall situation of emergency, such as an ongoing war. So again, I knew people who had lived through long, long periods of warfare in Cambodia and Laos. And, people would sometimes be presented with these kinds of options. Oh, okay, you have an injured foot, so you can't fight anymore. So do you want to be a nurse, or do you want to be a school teacher taking care of the children? Like, that's what their society needs. And you're talking about a society which is something like a refugee camp or something like an army camp out in the jungle. This is what we call the Vietnam War from the Western perspective, whatever. Oh, okay, well, look, there are kids you need to be taken care of. Do you want to get a little bit of training and start doing that? Or do you want to, hang out in the surgeon's theater and help them with, surgery and medical situations? You get a little bit of training. This is obviously, there's no university level education here, but you get some on-the-job training. And a lot of people live with this. And this was in a totally authoritarian situation where, the Communist Party running your camp or whatever it is says, oh, okay, you can't fight? Here are your choices. There might be just 2 or 3 choices. This is what you're going to do. You can't fight, you can't dig ditches, you can't stack up sandbags or something. There are other physically demanding jobs. Okay, well, here are your options. What are you going to do? And within the context of the desperation of having bombs falling out of the sky over your head, of not knowing if you're going to live or die, in the context of such acute human need and suffering as being in a refugee camp or being in the middle of a war zone or whatever, sure, we tend to overlook the authoritarian element. But it's of absolutely crucial importance. Who are you to decide that what's best for me is to become a nurse? Who are you to decide that what's best for me is to become a school teacher? Even if it seems so easy and beguiling to draw up this calculus that it would be in the greatest good for the greatest number of people to have me be a nurse or to have another 5,000 people become nurses, whatever the quota is that the government is pursuing. Who decides? Who decides what is in my best interest? Who decides? Who defines the greatest good, the greatest happiness, for the greatest number of people. It may seem very obvious to you, my viewer, whoever you are, that it's for the greatest happiness to provide teenagers with an education in high school that really has a lot of mixed signals about sexuality. Like, well, you're free to have sex when you want to, but you should use a condom because you can get pregnant and use AIDS. You know what I mean? This kind of normal 21st century liberal sex education. You may say it's in the greatest happiness for the greatest number of people to basically tell teenagers that it's okay for them to sleep around, but, you know, they got to use a condom and they got to worry about getting pregnant and getting AIDS and so on. You know what? There's a large number of people who are called conservatives. Where you live, they might be 51% of the population, they might be 31%. There are a lot of people called conservatives who say, no, 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 it's in the greatest happiness for the greatest number of people to teach those teenagers that they should remain celibate until marriage. Do you think there's an objectively real calculus we can present here? Do you think there isn't a subjective and authoritarian element of decision making? You know, there are people who are Muslim, Christian, Jewish. There are even some people who are Buddhist. You can talk to some conservative Japanese Buddhists probably, who really see the role of education in relation to sexuality as being restricting, delimiting, and defining in this way to avoid, of course, pregnancy and heartbreak and prostitution, all of the things that come out of having a more, sexually liberated society where people get to make those choices. What is the right solution? Now, I'm a nihilist. I also favor open democracy, okay? So I think you get people together who don't believe in anything, you let them discuss and debate and vote, and you have transparency and public accountability, and I hope that with the passage of time, people make the right decision, but they probably are going to make the wrong decision 5 times before they come to the right decision, okay? It's like a can of tomato sauce rolling down a staircase. The progress of democracy, has no geometric perfection to it, okay? It's never going to satisfy the fantasy of these guys reading John Stuart Mill. And again, what they're really reading indirectly is the fantasy of Wilhelm von Humboldt in his philosophy of education, and they don't even know it, okay? Now, on a one-to-one basis, I'm not an authority figure, but people watch my YouTube channel and they develop some kind of trust for me. And it's pretty often that they do ask me questions about their own education and their own career. People ask me questions like, will they personally be happy? Is it a good choice for them individually to become a nurse or not? And there's some people I've talked to enough where I get to know them a little bit. And I say, well, if you're going to become a nurse, there's these advantages and these disadvantages. If you're this kind of person, it could be okay, but think about this, think about that. And you kind of try to talk through different elements and draw their attention to, so they're making the decision themselves. I don't tell them what to think or what to conclude. Like, well, are you really this kind of person or not? Guys like Humboldt, because I don't want to make it sound like all the evil is on the part of John Stuart Mill and Humboldt was wrong. This philosophy of education stuff, okay, seems really easy to come to the conclusion that everyone should know how to wash their hands, how to avoid disease in that level. Okay, right. And the utility there is largely negative. It's avoiding disease. It's avoiding disastrous consequences. How do you think Humboldt came to this conclusion that it was like really meaningful for people to learn topics like geometry and algebra and ancient Greek philosophy? Do you think that's objectively real? Do you think there's a utilitarian pleasure-pain calculus that says that you ought to spend your time learning geometry, algebra, let's say theoretical physics, different types of math that you may never use in your life, that never may be meaningful to you? Individual people talk to me and they say they're thinking about getting a university degree in theoretical physics or theoretical math, this kind of abstract reasoning. And you can imagine on a one-to-one basis, you can talk to somebody and ask them, okay, do you really think this is going to be meaningful for you in your life? And think it all the way through, because it's possible, you study theoretical math, and then you go on to have a career that's really linked to that as a professor or some other field where you're really using it. But you know what? It's also very possible you get this university degree, you put all this time and effort into this kind of math, and then it's not part of your life after that, right? Like, is that still going to be meaningful for you if you go on and get a job in an unrelated field? A very large percentage of people will. I met guys who were working as English teachers in Bangkok, Thailand, in Beijing, China. I met guys, so they had PhDs, some of them, in theoretical physics or advanced mathematics, this kind of thing. And now they're teaching children in Asia how to say A is for apple, B is for ball. And that's the correct. Some people will be happy with that. Some people will feel like the study of mathematics is rewarding and meaningful and important in a way that's something they're going to carry with them for the rest of their lives, something they want to do, that's the person they want to be, that's the mode of thinking that for them is rewarding in an almost religious sense. They want to do it. It's the right choice for them. For some people, a life of service, being bossed around at the hospital, being the lowest rung in the hospital where the doctors treat you like crap and probably even the janitors treat you like crap, being a nurse in a hospital and wiping the poo off of some old man who has amoebic dysentery and helping people and coping and struggling with the schedule and sleep deprivation and human misery. There are some people for whom subjectively and almost religiously that's meaningful and that's rewarding. And not everyone. And we can never come to an objectively real utilitarian calculus where we say, this is the best thing for you as an individual, and then scaling it up, this is the best thing for society as a whole. I'm a snob. I really care about ancient Greek philosophy. I nevertheless think Wilhelm von Humboldt was a fucking maniac. He was an imbecile to think that the whole population of Germany should be forced to study ancient Greek philosophy. I think it's kind of unbelievably cruel that we force school children in Canada to learn types of advanced and theoretical mathematics that not even 1% of them will ever use in their lives after they leave school. And it's really denigrating. I mean, it may not be in the education system where you are. Even the way we teach English literature, grammar, the way we teach English in Canada, I find it denigrating and humiliating for the students, and you're dragging them through the mud for nothing. It won't benefit them in any way. It doesn't make them a better person. That's something Wilhelm von Humboldt was interested in. But any sincere inquiry into this, even within the philosophy of education, has to begin with the nihilistic recognition that I can never come to an objectively real conclusion about what is in your best interest in education this way. Not when we step outside of that very limited realm of wash your hands in order to avoid getting amoebic dysentery or other diseases that can be communicated by touch, right? As soon as we step beyond that, there's no way I can tell you it's in your best interest. It's for your greatest happiness for you to learn advanced geometry, advanced trigonometry, advanced algebra. And there's definitely no way I can say, hey, for the society as a whole, it's in the greatest good of the greatest number of people to force all of these children to learn this mathematical sum, to learn this particular branch of philosophy. Can't we recognize that this is just exercising authority, that this is the beating heart of authoritarianism that's been taken out of the context of the church fathers? It's been taken away from the village elder, and it's been put in the hands of an academic social science researcher. We've put a lab coat on it, but this is really no different from the village shaman claiming that he knows what's best for you, claiming that he knows what's best for society as a whole. The magic trick that utilitarians do is simply trying to ascribe to the universe as objectively real what are merely subjective judgments about what is pleasant and unpleasant, what is best for you, what is best for society as a whole. And those judgments ultimately are forced upon others in a manner that can only be described as authoritarian.